Well, hello everyone. We're gonna start the seminar. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to me to introduce you to Timothy Bowles. Tim, he's an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and the reason why he is here is because he's doing a sabbatical at the University of Barcelona, so it was kind of handy to invite him to join us at ICA. We were at La Poveda yesterday, seeing the field experiments that we are running there, and then he's going to give us a seminar today about some of his work, basically on soil. He's working on multiple aspects on the agroecological transitions, giving a lot of fundamental insights at the plant, soil, and ecosystem level on how this agroecological transition of our farming systems can work. And he interacts also a lot with social scientists to increase the policy impact. And yeah, we are looking forward to your seminar. So the floor is yours, Tim. Thank you.
Pues gracias a todos por estar aquí. Okay.
For those that are joining us via Zoom, you can ask questions later on the chat. So we can have a look on the chat later to see if there is any input there.
Vale. Pues otra vez gracias a todos por estar aquí. Agradezco mucho tener la oportunidad de compartir mi trabajo y okay, vamos. Yeah, so I want to tell you about a large interdisciplinary project that began a little while before COVID. And so I always like to start just by recognizing that it takes a lot of people to do this type of work. And so I was grateful to work with a large team of ecologists and social scientists and policy scholars, amazing PhD students and postdocs, along with a lot of farmers, as we'll see. And so I want to start at the sort of big level and recognize that agriculture currently is, as maybe we all know, and is a motivation for us to be here, is contributes about a third of our climate change forcing. It's the biggest contributor to biodiversity loss. And even today, close to 1 billion people are food insecure, right? So that's the role of agriculture now, but agriculture could be a major force to actually be addressing these challenges of the 21st century. And agroecology has offered us a framework for how we shift agricultural systems away from the intensive systems that were developed in the 20th century and to systems that are more reliant on ecological processes. And this is a classic framework for the relationship between planned biodiversity, the actions that farmers can take at multiple scales to bring biodiversity back into their farming systems at multiple scales in ways that affect the abiotic conditions and that can increase associated biodiversity and ultimately, ideally, lead to multiple ecosystem services that can help address some of those major challenges, right? And there, of course, has been lots and lots of work on this over the years, to the extent to which a few years ago, a large second-order meta-analysis was published looking at over 100 meta-analyses, tens of thousands of different comparisons of what happens when we do things like increase crop diversity, increase non-crop vegetation, reduce soil disturbance, on all sorts of different outcomes: biodiversity, pollination, soil fertility. And in most cases, not only do we see an increase in these types of ecosystem services when from these diversification practices, we also most of the time see a win-win with crop yield, right? Almost 2/3 of the cases or see an increase both in the ecosystem service and in crop yield. But I'd argue that we understand maybe a little bit less about these effects in soils. And we know that supporting soil multifunctionality in particular maybe is about more than just diversification per se. A large study across Europe that Pablo was involved with showed that actually crop diversity wasn't the best predictor of soil multifunctionality. It was actually crop cover. And we can, to sort of help us think more specifically about soils and not just diversification, we can use the principles of soil health as a helpful frame, which get beyond just diversification and also recognize the importance of maintaining those living roots and that crop cover, minimizing disturbance, etc. Another aspect that's a little more complicated in soils relative to, say, above ground ecosystem and biodiversity relationships are that, of course, soil functions depend on soil microbes, but there's a lot of potential redundancy in soil microbial communities, especially for relatively broad functions like nutrient cycling or the accrual of soil carbon. So how much does microbial diversity matter? And there are relatively few studies, this Garland et al. Being one exception, that have compared sort of the impact of multiple soil health principles with on multiple ecosystem services. And of course, we also have to take into account the effect of inherent soil properties, which might be sort of an even more important driver of the services that soils provide relative to management. Okay, so all of this is about the potential for diversification practices to create multiple ecosystem services and multifunctionality. But what about actually changing how farming and how agriculture is done? Well, we then have to shift our mindset from studying diversified farming systems to asking, how do we diversify farming system? We have to make that a verb, right? And social scientists and policy scholars have looked at what are all the influences that that affect whether farmers can transition to more diversified farming systems. What are the odds? What affects the probability of diversification? And a lot of times this focus has been on farmers' agency. Do they have the motivation to do it? Do they have uh, the relationships to do it, right? But of course, it also matters what the type of resources that they have. Or do they have secure land? Do they have secure markets? And what's the structure, the structural environment in which they're operating, the political economy? And these three things together, agency, resources, and structure, all have to be sort of lined up, right? That's what this diagram here on the left is showing us, is that all of these have to be lined up for us to actually see a pathway towards diversification. Right? And finally, we have to remember that these transitions to more diversified farming systems are embedded in what agroecologists have called territories. And territories are conceptualized as places that are engaging in a transition process. They have to go, we have to think beyond just the farm scale and think about whole landscapes, think about relationships with food systems and other governance structures, relationships with stakeholders. Basically, the point is transitions to more diversified farming systems, to agroecology, are taking place in particular places with particular sets of circumstances, and that we should be able to study those in sort of their particular circumstances. And so we need to have these types of integrated studies of social ecological systems to identify pathways toward diversification within territories, as well as any trade-offs or tensions that might exist. Places where we can study, for instance, the agency and resources that farmers have as they make decisions to diversify or not their farming systems, how policies or supply chains affect those decisions. And then, of course, more as an ecologist, how do those decisions end up affecting ecosystem properties and biodiversity, and in turn, ecosystem services, right? So this is the broad framework that our project began with in studying diversified farming systems in a particular place in California that we call the salad bowl of California. Okay, this is just south of the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a coastal environment influenced a lot by the cold Pacific Ocean. So unlike the really hot, dry parts of California, it's still a Mediterranean climate with a strong winter rainy season and a dry summer season. But it's also heavily moderated by the ocean. So not a lot of temperature extremes. And so there's a ton of very intensive vegetable and berry production here. This is almost $5 billion worth of agricultural production in this region alone. In just to give you some examples of the main crops, this is $1.3 billion in just lettuce, right? And so this is supplying a huge market in the United States and internationally. It's a very intensive area of agriculture. I'd argue some of the most intensive in the world in terms of the inputs of fertilizers, pesticides, the frequency and intensity of tillage. You see this is a field that's been laser leveled, remarkably, clean, no weeds. But what's also interesting is that there's a lot of organic producers here, a lot of innovative farmers um, who have been trying alternative systems for decades. But because of the intensive agriculture, there's a lot of environmental justice problems that have arisen. So this is a map showing the levels of nitrate in drinking water wells in California. Um, and the area that I'm talking about is kind of over here on the left. The red dots are where the level of nitrate has exceeded acceptable levels for human consumption. There are over 1 million people in California that don't have access to clean drinking water, and it's mostly in rural areas that rely on wells. So there's been a strong policy response to that the state has enacted. At the same time, these are all irrigated production systems, and irrigation has depleted a lot of our groundwater. And so we have critical overdraft of a lot of groundwater aquifers, including on this left-hand side in the Central Coast. The state also is very interested in agriculture's role in climate change mitigation both through the reduction of emissions and through the increase of soil carbon, and has created incentive programs to help move farmers along. I won't talk about as much this today, but it's relevant just to understand the system here. I love this sign: no trespassing, no animals allowed here, right? Birds, wildlife don't come, right? It's an area of where food safety, things like E. coli, listeria, have led to outbreaks that have killed a number of people over the last 20 years. And so it's also an area where farmers have actually removed a lot of natural vegetation and natural habitat because they feel like wildlife is responsible for bringing these pathogens into the lettuce, into berries, and causing these food safety problems, right? This is just to give you a little bit of a background on where we're working. So in this region with this very, very intensive agriculture, where for maybe half or two-thirds of the year, many of the fields look like the top right? How could diversifying farming systems and soil-based ecosystem services, could they help address any of these challenges of water quality, climate change mitigation, et cetera? So just to specify a little bit, for our project, this is the same schema here that I showed you earlier. And I'm going to start by kind of on the biophysical side, and then we'll talk a little bit about the social science work that we did as well. So this was a study. It was an observational study working with a set of just organic farms, but a set of organic farms that varied quite a bit in terms of their management, how they used diversification practices. But by focusing only on organic farms, we could kind of avoid any confounding effects of things like pesticides and synthetic fertilizers and focus only on the range of diversification or soil health practices. We did a lot of on-farm work measuring different soil-based ecosystem services. We paired this with interviews with farmers. And we did, I won't show it here, but we also did some modeling of coupled natural human systems dynamics. And just to give you a sense of when this was, this is the date right here for our big advisory group meeting before our field season. This is March 4th, 2020. I think California shut down 2 days later. But we managed to have our field season. And but here we are 5 years later, still trying to get this work finished. COVID slowed us down quite a bit. So we worked across 28 different sites, sampling it several times throughout the lettuce growing season. There was a range of soil characteristics from relatively sandy soils to relatively clay soils, as well as, and I'll circle back to why this is important, also a gradient of sort of the complexity and the land use of the landscape surrounding the farm fields. So the color coding that you see down here is the proportion of cropland within a 500-meter radius of each of our sampling sites. This picture kind of gives you a sense. This is surrounded by nearly 100% agricultural land, very intensive landscape, and then this is a field embedded in a much more mixed land use matrix down here. So we defined sort of we went from kind of soil health principles to practices that we defined and we learned about through our interviews and surveys, as well as some remote sensing that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So we were looking at the living cover of soil, the amount of organic amendments that were added, the diversity of both cash and cover crops, and soil disturbance. And so on the x-axis here are each of our sampling sites. And then this is a standardized score of each of these management variables. The main point here is to show that there's a lot of variation and heterogeneity across this set of organic farms. They were all growing lettuce in this season. They're all organic farms, and yet they vary tremendously in their management. So just as a little bit of an aside, it also brings into question how much these categories of like conventional and organic really mean when there's so much variability within these systems. So first, I want to talk a little bit about this first arrow here. How does this variation in soil health properties affect both soil biodiversity? And then we'll also talk about some soil chemical properties as well. So we looked at the soil bacterial and fungal communities. And this is showing some results of crop diversity and cover cropping on metrics of diversity of both the bacterial community on the left and the fungal community on the right. So these were just the significant effects that we found, where I'd say perhaps not too surprisingly, based on the relationship between plant diversity and soil microbial diversity, we found a relationship between positive relationship between crop diversity and bacterial diversity and the ecological diversity of fungi. Interestingly, we found a negative relationship between the ecological diversity of fungi and cover cropping, which I could talk a little bit why we think that is. It could be that the relatively high biomass of cover crops in these systems, that in these vegetable systems, they don't produce a lot, the cash crops don't produce a lot of biomass often. Think about lettuce. It could be that it stimulates the growth of a small set of more competitive fungi that then was reducing the ecological diversity of the community. It's one possibility. So of course, we're not the first to show these types of relationships, but we were also interested not only in the effect of these, I'll say, within the field practices, but we also wanted to know does the surrounding environment have any effect on the soil microbial community within the field? This may sound a little bit odd to microbial ecologists. It wouldn't sound odd if we were studying bees or pests. Of course, the landscape matters a lot. But also, we know that microbes can actually be dispersal limited. Everything is not everywhere necessarily. And that's possible that the surrounding environment may actually influence the composition or the diversity of soil communities. So that's what we are hypothesizing. We wanted to see whether more natural areas, surrounding fields might affect the diversity of bacterial fungal communities, but we did expect these landscape effects to be weaker than the effects of management within the field. Interestingly, we found the opposite. This is a variation partitioning of the composition of the bacterial and the fungal community into local, that is, within field soil health practices, effects of landscape composition, effects of soil edaphic, more inherent soil properties like texture and mineralogy, and then effects of climate. What we found is that the composition of the landscape surrounding these fields explained, uh, well, in the case of bacteria, almost twice as much variation in the community, and about the same amount of variation in the community as the fungi. That is, the effect of the landscape was similar or greater than the effect of these within field management practices on the composition of the community. And not just the community. We actually found that, for instance, the proportion of agricultural area surrounding the field had a negative effect on the predicted metabolic richness of bacteria. And we found several more significant effects on the fungal community, depending on the type of land composition around. Also, a negative effect of the proportion of agricultural area on ecological richness of fungi. So this, to say the least, we don't know the mechanism here. Is it potentially the dispersal of microbes from these surrounding areas during cycles of disturbance that then go on to affect community assembly in these fields? So this raises as many more questions as it does answers, but to us it was an exciting result in the sense of that the landscape matters, it potentially matters for microbes as well as above ground organisms. Now I'll talk a little bit about sort of these next set of relationships. How does diversification practices and soil health principles affect ecosystem services and disservices directly and as well as mediated through changes in the soil? So I'll start by a focus just on, of course, anybody who studies soil knows that soil organic matter is this sort of master variable that controls a lot of, or at least is related to a lot of other soil functions. And we think of soil organic matter as we can divide this into two fractions. Particulate organic matter, which is younger, it's more plant derived, it has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, as well as versus mineral associated organic matter, which tends to be older, tends to have been processed by microbes, has a lower C to N ratio. And we think of it, maybe not entirely correctly, but we think of it as more of a persistent soil carbon pool. Work by Francesca Catrufo and others has hypothesized that the relative proportion of POM versus MAOM is related to nitrogen cycling outcomes. So for instance, an ecosystem that is more nitrogen limited, where nitrogen is mobilized, versus one that has a very open nitrogen cycle. So there's this relationship between organic matter, carbon and nitrogen coupling. And they've also sort of hypothesized some of the traits that control the relative sizes of the POM and MAOM pools, both so-called soil traits, things like texture and mineralogy, as well as more, I'll say, higher level controls like climate or vegetation properties. So we'll follow up on that a little bit. Just to our farms, this area is MAOM dominated. that actually fits well with this model in the sense that this is on the more water limited end climate wise. Mayom carbon accounts for about 3/4 of the soil carbon stocks in the surface across these sites. Now, we wanted to know how the both soil traits, things like texture and mineralogy, as well as soil health principles, were affecting these pools of these stocks of particulate and mineral associated organic matter, as well as total carbon. So we used some statistical models to try to separate out these effects. We had a set of effects for texture and mineralogy. We had a set of effects for soil health principles. And what we found is that living cover was the largest effect on palm, mayom, and carbon stocks. It relative to the other soil health practices. So, for instance, I'm not showing all of the other graphs, but we see a positive relationship between living cover and free particulate organic matter, as well as mineral associated and as well as total carbon stocks. Some of the other soil health principles did have some effects too, but somewhat less prevalent. For instance, reducing disturbance increased mayom, crop diversity increased occluded particulate organic matter. Interestingly, the range of addition of organic matter amendments, these are organic farms that are using compost primarily, uh, uh, had no effect across this set of sites. What was also interesting to us is that we could partition the variation between in palm and mayom pools between what was variation associated with soil properties, texture, and mineralogy versus management. And interestingly, across all of the fractionated organic matter, management had a stronger influence than soil traits. The exception was bulk soil carbon, where adaphic properties had explained more of the variation. Now, this wasn't because we had a narrow range of soil texture and mineralogy. This is plotting the sites across the soil texture triangle. We had quite a range of soil texture embedded here, and yet management was still the bigger driver on these pools. So at this sort of scale, in a similar, in a regional scale with a similar climate, understanding variation in agricultural management is apparently quite important for understanding patterns of soil organic matter. Okay. So now I'll talk about just a little bit of the different ecosystem services that we measured, right? These are, of course, influenced by everything that I've talked about so far, the soil microbes, the soil organic matter pools. But these were indicators of different ecosystem services. Of course, we measured crop yields. We considered carbon storage. We didn't look at a change in soil carbon, but looked at the stocks as an indicator of climate regulation. We looked at the soil nitrate stock down to 60 centimeters at the end of the cash crop as an indicator of potential for nitrogen loss. So the more nitrate was left at the end of the growing season, the more potential there was for nitrogen losses through leaching. And then we also looked at measures of soil fertility and nutrient cycling capacity, and considered soil fungal and bacterial diversity as sort of a habitat provisioning or a supporting type ecosystem service. But I won't talk about all of these individually. We'd be here for hours. But we decided to combine these into a multifunctionality index and then weight them differently depending on what we sort of assumed about some different stakeholder priorities. So we looked at an even weighting where each of the services had the same weight in the multifunctionality index. We had a more production focused where yields had a higher weighting. an environmental focus where water quality protection and climate regulation had a higher weighting, and so on. And again, what we found, you'll see a theme here, is that continuous living cover was the most important principle for multifunctionality, no matter how we weighted it. Now, the relationship became more or less strong, the explanatory power became more or less strong, but in all cases, it was significant. And in all cases, it was the only soil health principle or diversification practice that explained these multifunctionality indices across sort of the even weighting in panel A, more productivity focused in panel B, and so on. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this particular metric of living cover. What this is a metric of living cover that we detected with remote sensing. And we asked for the prior 5 years before we sampled, how many months of exceeded a threshold of NDVI that separates sort of bare soil from sparse vegetation. So this proportion of the 5-year is how many of the months in the previous 5 years had some level of vegetation or not. And what I love is that during a conversation with Phil Foster, when we had gone back to share the results of just what we had measured on his farm, he said, you know, I think what makes my farm different from the farms around me is that I always have plants in the ground as much as I can, right? I harvest something, I plant something, I always am growing cover crops. And you look around here, and that's really different. Can you guys measure that somehow? And so we translated this into a remote sensing metric and came up with, the best explanatory variable in our model. Also, with multifunctionality, management is accounting for 3 times as much variance in the multifunctionality as inherent soil properties. So I take this to mean that there's opportunity across a wide range of soil contexts to build more multifunctional agricultural systems. So we went from this metric and we asked, okay, well, this is clearly important. And we know anecdotally that there's not a lot of living cover in this region. But what does it actually look like at a regional scale? So first, we mapped one aspect of living cover, that's winter cover crops. And we found that only about 6% of total farmland area in this region had winter cover crops. The majority of farmland during the winter was bare soil, 60%. We did see some hot spots of adoption in hillier areas where land values are a little bit lower. Small farms are a little bit smaller. And then we also said, okay, this living cover crops are one aspect of living cover, but cover crops are just one way of increasing plant cover. So what if we took that same metric that we looked at just on an individual field basis and then looked at it at every parcel of land in the region? And so these are histograms showing the proportion of annual cropland that has vegetation over a 5-year period from 2015 through 2019. And so these are the 3 counties where we are working: Monterey, San Benito, and Santa Cruz County. Yeah, you can see some pretty interesting regional differences that we hope to follow up on. But you can also see that the median value of the proportion of year is maybe around 35-40% in Monterey and San Benito County. That is, about half of farms have vegetation on their soil for 40% or less of this 5-year period, right? It's a pretty low number. In our study, the mean continuous living cover was 54%. The minimum was 23% and the max was 90%. So our set of sampling sites covered this distribution pretty well. Okay. So clearly there's a lot of differences in how farmers are managing their land in this region. And our social science team set out to understand a little bit about why that is, and to understand in particular the type of socioeconomic environment in which farmers are operating. So these are the folks that we worked with who did a lot of this research. Most of this was through very in-depth, several hour-long interviews with each of the farmers involved, and then a really in-depth survey of management practices. We also talked with technical assistance providers, people who know these farmers really well, to get their perspectives too. And sort of from all of these interviews, three sort of groups of farms kind of emerged, each of them with a distinct, what we called farming model. Farming model is this sort of hypothetical, theoretical construct that contains both a business model that a farmer has for their sort of economic survival, an ecological model for sort of how they farm, and a mental model for how they think about their farm ecosystem. And these three groups were sort of farmers with limited capital resources, what we called mid-scale diversified farms that were a little bit larger, as well as very large. These are 1,000 hectares or more farms that are growing for international markets. All of them grow the similar suite of crops. They're all growing vegetables and berries, right? They're growing in very different contexts, economically speaking. So for example, for limited resource farmers, they are very small. They have very small farms. They have low land tenure. They don't own their land. They're renting their land, often with very short contracts of 1 or 2 or 3 years. Their use of diversification practices is relatively limited because they can't plan for very long if they're only on their land for a year or two at a time. And they have limited sort of time and labor available, right? This quote here, if you're leasing, you're not going to plant perennials like hedgerows. We'd like to have it all covered, but we don't have the money to cover everything. Large wholesale farmers, on the other hand, were ones that it's big business, it's big money, and it's risky, right? These are very competitive markets. We have to have the higher dollar cash crops because obviously the price of everything is going up. And so economic constraints due to the limited flexibility in their markets, their very tight planting schedules, so they meet their contract deadlines. All of this sort of constrains their use of diversification practices. And then we have this other group of sort of somewhere in the middle who have often been on their land for a long time. They're more likely to own their land. They have more local or regional markets that reward them for managing more ecologically. This is sort of part of their philosophy, their ethos, right? And they are able to use a lot more incorporate a lot more diversification and soil health practices onto their farms. All right. So I've covered a lot of ground already. I have a little bit more that I want to share, but I'll just want to pause for some takeaways. I think one takeaway for me, and these are as much about takeaways as they are about new questions, right? If the landscape influences soil microbial communities, what does that mean for ecosystem processes in these farms within areas of crop production? And I'll say what particular aspects of landscapes are more or less important for microbes? And what are the mechanisms involved in this relationship between landscape composition and microbial communities? Another question that brings up for me, should living cover be considered the main influence on soil health and ecosystem services in agricultural systems? Yes, limiting disturbance might matter. Um, Adding organic amendments might matter. But if plants are the conduit of the sun's energy into soil to fuel microbial life and faunal life, maybe living cover we should consider to be the main influence. Another takeaway for me is that co-interpretation of results with farmers leads to new insights. Right? We wouldn't have necessarily thought of this metric of living cover without having had this conversation with Phil Foster. And finally, while these ecosystem services could address challenges, building soil carbon, um, protecting water quality, clearly there are some significant barriers that exist, and they vary depending on sort of the farming model that a farmer is operating in. Now, just a few more kind of reflections to close out here. We are not the first people to point out that things like markets and land tenure and uh, and motivations and capital resources matter for how people farm. And we were looking at historical documents from this region from 100 years ago and found similar perspectives. There was a document from 1935 that said something like, market forces limit the type of crop rotation that farmers can do in this area of very high land values. And you're like, wow, we've just reinvented the same results over again 100 years later. So we called this the remarkable persistence of familiar obstacles. And so this really made us ask ourselves, what could we do so that researchers 20 years from now, 50 years from now will not be finding the same thing, right? Well, we don't have necessarily the answers, but we at least know that there's no one-size-fits-all solution in terms of how policies need to be structured. Limited resource farmers are going to need direct financial support, mechanisms for achieving land tenure. These large-scale, big business wholesale farmers are going to need pressure either from their supply chains, from the big retailers like Walmart, or simply regulation in order to change what they're doing. And these mid-sized farms might be models for how others can farm profitably. But how long could these models, how good of a model is this? If these regional, more values-based markets, for instance, how big are these markets? This isn't something that's necessarily that we can replicate across all of these different types of farms, right? And I'll just end on just sharing a little bit about where we are now in terms of thinking and sort of how this project kind of evolved into what we're working on now. Well, we of course found this consistent influence of living cover on soil multifunctionality. And so we wanted to work with limited resource farmers in particular to try to see if there's anything that we could do to increase their use of living cover and cover crops. And one of the things that farmers shared with us in this study is one of the reasons, kind of economics and land aside, that they're cautious about planting cover crops is that they're scared that cover crops will consume water, right? This is this is a Mediterranean environment, right? You're familiar with this, of course. And of course, planting plants increases transpiration. It also reduces evaporation, right? But what's the balance? What's the timing? Farmers don't want to have to irrigate more after they planted a cover crop. They don't want to have to irrigate a cover crop to get it established. So we have set up a project that just is really starting started last year and now is expanding this year. with a model that I'm really excited about. I was telling Pablo a little bit about it yesterday. Um, this parent-baby model where we have a replicated field experiment at UC Santa Cruz testing different cover crop species combinations, timing of termination, and planting, kind of an agronomic field experiment where we're monitoring plot level of evapotranspiration, we're monitoring soil moisture, soil nitrate, um, biomass accumulation. But then we've also established relationships with technical assistance providers in the region, and we're on 30 farms, and these are mostly small scale, mostly Spanish or indigenous language speaking farmers that have immigrated from Mexico or Central America, where we are doing just a side-by-side experiment on their farms, and we pay for the cost of the cover crops. We go in and we monitor, and then the idea is to sort of set up a knowledge exchange network, right, across this group of farmers that's all trying this for the first time, so that one farmer can say, well, I tried it with this direct seeder, and it worked okay, but, and then another person can say, oh yeah, well, I tried it this way and it was a little better for me, right? So knowledge sharing in this agroecological sense. So we can kind of have the best of both worlds in the sense of a replicated experiment where we have a lot of control, as well as getting this, seeing what happens just in side-by-side trials across a range of soil types, and also trying to, at the same time, foster some interactions among this group of farmers. So I know I've covered a lot of ground. I'm at time, but I want to thank you for your attention and allowing me to share some of the work that we do. I'm happy to take questions.
The team for a very very inspiring talk. I think sometimes is really nice from the point of view of an audience to be able to listen for a whole story from the beginning of a project until the end, and see how this grow up into a new initiative that you want to follow up. So yeah, I think it was really nice to see your presentation. There is any question that you want to ask to Tim? Anna?
So thank you very much. It was very interesting. And I loved it that you spoke about soil type, which is something that I'm really interested in working right now. But I was puzzled by the fact that you spoke about the importance of the landscapes around these croplands. And I was wondering whether you have any hypothesis about why. But I know you said that you're not really sure this is one of your future research topics, but what do you mean by, how do you quantify, or how do you define landscape in this case?
Let me go back to, I can show you a little bit. There it is. The way that we define landscape was, I'll say, simple, even simplistic. Around each of the fields where we sampled, we defined, we tried a different radius. We tried a 500-meter radius, a 1-kilometer radius, and then we used aerial photography and characterized each of the land use types in the GIS system to say, okay, this is agricultural land, this is grassland, this is urban land, and in the area around the field, and so then we have these various land use types that we defined, and the predictor then that goes into the model is the proportion of each of these land use types, the value of that proportion for each field site. Others have suggested since then that you should have thought about configuration as well, and I think there's all sorts of landscape ecologists would have lots of ideas for this. So I think of this as like the first step. In terms of mechanisms, I'm I think going into it, I think it has to be something related to dispersal dynamics. You know, that's the only thing that would make sense to me. You know, we think of, and I'll make the caveat that I'm not a microbial community ecologist. I don't study community assembly per se, but my guess is that these are, you know, the agricultural land here undergoes a lot of disturbance, and that there might be dispersal happening from you know, when tillage happens and you see all of that soil, the dust going into the air and moving around, and even from some of the natural systems as maybe water flows or the wind picks up larger, you know, fungal spores and this kind of thing, right? And then the sort of how that dispersal, the land use around a field influences the source communities that are available then to land in the agricultural fields, and then affect community composition and diversity. That's the best. And I know it's still a little fuzzy, but
then it was the diversity of different landscapes surrounding the crop, or not the type so much, but
in ours, this was the type. It wasn't. We didn't look at the diversity of the landscapes. We just looked at. So the x-axis is like the proportion of agricultural area. I think landscape diversity, again, these are things where I'm like, oh yeah, we should have done that. We should have done that. I think landscape, you know, a weighted metric of landscape diversity could be really interesting. I mean, again, to me, I think this raises as many questions as it does answers. Yeah.
Sorry, and just to finish the previous one, yeah, I was just going to ask you about the importance of the soil. When you say their soil, you mean the soil types, different types?
Yeah, soil, and what I think of as inherent, you know, soil properties, texture, and mineralogy. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Questions? I have a question too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so living cover, critical variable.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, I was very, very happy to see that, because we found it too in that European scale level in cereal fields from Spain to Sweden. We were not looking at that variable. We were just addressing a gradient of crop diversity, but that one really emerged. No, it's a variable that, of course, it's been always there. You know, from agricultural conservation. But they were talking about, you know, the residue incorporation and the crop residues that were already in the field. So do not let the soil bare.
Right.
And that is like a one step forward. No, it's not only crop residues, but a live plant.
Right.
So rhizosphere is one of the key, like, you know, mechanisms that should be leading that response. So I wanted to highlight that. And yeah, and also it's important to say, I think that is one of the few, like if you understand that as an agronomic management, one of the few managements that you can do where there is not very important trade-offs between crop productions and ecosystem multifunctionality or ecosystem functions such as, I don't know, pest control, water retention, carbon sequestration, soil fertility, which is not the rule. Usually you have trade-offs. You were talking about trade-offs at the beginning of your talk. And I think it's important to highlight that, because there are always trade-offs in agricultural systems. And as you have seen, we also found the same, that there was not an important trade-off between productivity and function. And I think that's amazing. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, no, I agree, both on the point about the rhizosphere in particular, right? Soil cover from the standpoint of residue, that matters sort of for soil erosion, and that's important. But living plants, right? I mean, if soil is driven by soil biology, plants are bringing the energy of the sun into the soil. Of course, it makes sense, right? That living plants matter, and for me, it's we've tried to create this scalable remote sensing metric of living cover, in part from at least my point of view, to broaden the conversation beyond just cover crops, which of course we still focus on, but to say that it doesn't maybe really matter what the plant, what the use of it is. You could be planting broccoli over the winter, and it probably has the same function as whether you're growing a cover crop from this, more or less, right? And it's not necessarily a popular opinion, at least in the policy arena, in the policy environment in the United States, where I've worked, I've talked about this with large NGOs and government agencies that say, well, we can't incentivize a principle. What's the practice? And I say, well, the practice doesn't matter. The outcome is what matters. And so it's, but I'm hoping maybe to broaden the conversation a little bit, and say, yeah, farmers have a lot of flexibility in terms of how they might achieve this. They can do, but the important thing is just that there's roots around. Yeah. Well, if I should check Zoom or not, I think we're at time.
Look on that. I think we have time.
Um,
So if anyone is there on Zoom, I think there were a few people connected. Please go ahead and make question in the chat. In the meantime, anyone wants to go for another question? No
questions in the chat.
Yeah. Asier.
Hi. I have a question about the nitrate contamination you talked
Yeah.
about. Does these living crops help maintaining those nitrates in the soil plant system and avoiding that nitrate to, lixiviate to those waters?
Yes, I think the main answer, the easy answer is yes. I think like much of Spain, we get all of our rain in the winter, and as we saw, that's also when most of the land in this area has no vegetation at all. And so any soil nitrate that's still left in the soil profile after the cash crop is finished, or any additional mineralization and nitrification that's still happening over the winter, that's all going to be flushed out without plants around, to sort of temporarily hold the nitrogen. This is getting a little bit wonky, but what's interesting is that there's a regulatory agency that's supposed to be trying to help with this water quality problem. They've mostly focused on fertilizer and fertilizer application, which of course isn't maybe the most important thing. But they have also recognized now that farmers can effectively get credits if they plant winter cover crops, that sort of help them meet their regulatory requirements. And the idea is that, you're temporarily holding this nitrate, at least until the next cash crop is available, grows. Lots of details matter, the timing of growth relative to the timing of rains and all of that, but the short answer is yes, it should matter. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, more questions? Cesar?
Hello, team. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. My question is a little bit specific. It's about the organic amendments.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you didn't find any effects. Do you have an explanation for that?
I am honestly, I'm confused. So I don't have a good explanation. I mean, I think it could be a limitation of an observational study. there's been a long-term experiment in the same region that showed that compost did have an effect on soil carbon. That experiment was on a very sandy, granitic soil. It's almost 80% sand. It's like farming on the beach. And so it's possible that we didn't have enough combinations of soil texture and management to see where and when exactly so organic amendments might have a positive effect. Because we know that it should. So my hunch, my guess is that it has an effect in there's probably an interaction between organic amendment and soil properties, and we didn't have the full range of sites to be able to see that interaction very well. Otherwise I don't understand why it wouldn't be.
I was going to point out the thing that maybe like the range of variation in organic amendments, it's quite small because most of these, since they are all organic,
Yeah.
but they are all using a lot of organic inputs, and you don't have
that could also be it. There is some variation. I mean, maybe, but everybody is using something, right? They're all using a relatively high carbon to nitrogen compost. They don't use any animal manure because of food safety concerns. So yeah, it's also maybe that it's just the range and the qualitative and quantitative aspects of the organic amendments isn't high enough for us to be able to see the effect.
Okay. Any more questions, or I think we can finish. If not, the seminar. Thank you again.
Thank you all so much.